Change lives.
cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变世界
Change organization.
Dunia may berlalu.
Change the world.
I've always been interested in how to use scientific theory to help people. So, my interests as a researcher is in bridging scientific theory, especially in social psychology, with application, using theory to help solve social problems. The message of the research that we've been doing has been to show how relatively brief social psychological interventions can have significant effects on important social outcomes, such as education. We've been testing the effects of various kinds of what we call social psychological interventions on outcomes such as academic performance, GPA, health outcomes like BMI. What we've been struck by is how theoretically informed and precisely targeted interventions, even when small, can have lasting and large effects. So what we did was to randomly assign some students to complete this writing exercise in which they focused on an important value. Other kids completed a more neutral control condition in which they wrote about their daily routine or an unimportant value. And then we followed the kids for actually 2 years. What we found was that those children, those African Americans who had received the affirmation, did better academically. And this effect persisted for 2 years. Specifically, they got better grades. They were lifted up sufficiently so that there was a closure in the racial achievement gap of roughly 30% over 2 years. Probably one way to give an intuitive feel for the nature of this effect is that we found, for instance, that the number of kids getting a D or below in the first quarter of this class after the intervention was given fell from about 20% to 10%. It was halved. This was an intervention that was based on a lot of previous research, a lot of psychological theory. It seems relatively small, but one of the things we've been thinking is that perhaps these things that seem small actually aren't so small, that being given the opportunity to affirm an important source of value in a threatening context might actually be a big experience, like a sort of water on parched soil effect. For some of these students, school, as for all of us, school or work can be chronically threatening. The problem comes when the threat gets too intense. And work by Claude Steele, Steve Spencer, Josh Aronson, and our group as well has shown is that regardless of the actual prejudice in a school environment, the perception that I could be negatively stereotyped or discriminated against can cause stress. And very small, subtle cues can sort of bring about this stress. For instance, if a professor makes a reference to popular culture that an international student doesn't quite understand, that could kind of convey a message of alienation or kind of make the person feel more alienated than they otherwise might. These very kind of small cues, but also not so small cues, can set in motion this stress reaction. And that can happen regardless of the actual level of prejudice in the environment. And that's really important. So they enable the expression of what's already there in the student or the school environment. If a kid feels stressed out, they won't be able to approach their teacher for help with ease. They won't be able to explore opportunities for growth and learning as much as they could otherwise. The interventions, by buoying up a sense of positive regard and self-integrity, enable children to seize on the opportunities for learning that are there already. And if they're not there, they're not going to have much of an effect. The premise of this research was that stress is really bad for health outcomes, at least when prolonged and chronic or repetitive. We're really interested in, and this is with my colleagues Greg Walton and Carol Dweck, is how to scale up these interventions to reach more kids. I think the devil's in the details in a lot of these interventions. We spend a lot of time getting the details right, working with the kids to find values that are relevant, working in the specific context to make the writing exercise intelligible and impactful. There's a lot of stuff under the hood in the preparation of these things. We're not just throwing the intervention at people. Small differences between individuals can compound over time. In a lot of work in school settings, if I do poorly, poor performance begets worse performance, and this repeating cycle. And so if you can interrupt that repeating chain early, sufficiently early when it's embryonic, then you might have a lasting effect on a kid's trajectory through school, through their career, through their life.
Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变世界
Change organization.
Dunia menbelau.
Transformar el mundo.
Change the world.